Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to welcome you to this panel that is part of the Berlin Demography Days. I also do that on behalf of our co-organizer Diakonie Deutschland and our international cooperation partners. My name has been mentioned a few times. Population Europe, just very briefly, is a network that today comprises 39 research institutes in the field of demography from all over Europe. I today have the honor of moderating this high caliber panel. Let me start by briefly introducing the participants, and you will find out more about them later. I will start with the person to my right. Hermann Gröhe has been a member of the German Bundestag since 1994 and is currently a deputy chairman of the CDU-CSU parliamentary group, the Christian Democrats. Between 2013 and 2018, he was Federal Minister of Health. Above all, however, he is a chairman of the advisory board of the Berlin Demography Days, for which I would like to take this opportunity to thank him very warmly. I now look at the other side of the panel, Dr. Antje Draheim. She's State Secretary at the Federal Ministry of Health. I'm particularly pleased that she comes from Rostock, where our home institute, the Max Planck Institute for Demographic Research, is located. A while ago, we had already had an exchange about local patriotism. For a while. To my left, Pearl Dykstra. She is professor for empirical sociology at the Erasmus University Rotterdam and scientific advisor to the European Commission. She was a member of the chief scientific advisors to the cabinet of the European Commissioners, 2016 to 2019. She also was deputy chair of it. And last but not least, Dr. Georg Schütte has been Secretary General of the Volkswagen Foundation since 2020. Prior to that, he was State Secretary at the Federal Ministry of Education and Research. Before that, Secretary General of the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. First of all, thank you very much for pledging to be here and for joining us today. Briefly about the procedure, we will first discuss on the panel, and then you are cordially invited to ask your questions afterwards. The guests participating online can do so via the Q&A button at the bottom of the screen. And we will then see the questions. We will find that button at the lower part of the screen. And for our guests here in the room, 2 room microphones are available. Please do join the discussion, otherwise I will do that, and this might be a bit less interesting for you. For many, it seems as if we have been living in a permanent crisis mode since the turn of the millennium, and especially since the coronavirus pandemic. Crisis mode has therefore even been voted Word of the Year 2023 in Germany. We will get back to that in a while. Yet the 1990s were anything but calm or stable. Much of what we see as a crisis today is put into perspective if we look at the situation in which many people around the world have to live from a global perspective rather than a European perspective. After all, many of the problems that we perceive as part of a crisis today have been predicted for decades, such as global warming or demographic change. What perhaps makes the decade we're living in so special is that we are facing a global situation that seems to threaten our very existence as an entire human race. Whether this threat is triggered by unknown virus strains, impending tipping points, or out-of-control states. And that we live in an age in which information can be disseminated to thousands and thousands of people worldwide in a matter of seconds, and above all, unfiltered. It's time for the Berlin Demography Days to address these issues. But you might ask, why demography in particular? Our discipline has always conducted research at the interface between politics, society, and business. Demography looks into the size and composition of the population and how this changes over time and space. Knowledge of this is one of the most important prerequisites of decision-making, because if we do not have sufficient knowledge about the age, place of residence, marital status, and family behavior, educational attainment and access to the labor market, as well as health and life expectancy of the population, regardless of whether they have been living locally for generations or have just immigrated from another region or country, we are planning political, entrepreneurial, or socio-political decisions in the fog, so to speak. And as was once said in a crisis, we would be driving by sight. However, these few factors mentioned, age, family, education, work, health, life, and origin, also show that demography is not only relevant to politics, but also significant for each and every one of us. Because it tells us something about our own development opportunities and chances in the course of our lives and in our society, and about those people who are unable to take advantage of these opportunities because, for example, they are ill, lonely, poorly educated, and unemployed, or threatened by inadequate public services or even hunger and violence. Demography is therefore a discipline that not only allows us to understand where we can develop ourselves and as a society, but also who we need to protect in particular. However, the Berlin Demography Days are not primarily about scientific evidence. Rather, we want to discuss with experts from politics, society, and business, and with you, and learn from each other how we can better understand the crises we have behind us and how we can better prepare for the crises we are facing. If you have not already watched the panels today, I cordially invite you to join us online on one of the afternoons over the next 2 days. It's well worth it. This evening, however, we will turn to a more fundamental topic, namely the question of how we can shape cooperation between science, politics, and society in such a way that we can better prepare ourselves for situations in which rapid decision-making is required. We have seen how important this is during the pandemic and in the other crises of the last 2 decades. And that's what I want to discuss with my guests today. Now, I will start to the right again, namely Mr. Gröhe. As a member of the German Bundestag, you have dealt very intensely with labor and social policies, but also with development policy issues and global health. Pandemics, climate change, and refugee migration from war zones have taught us that these policy areas can hardly be considered separately from each other at a national or regional level. What are your personal experiences from the crisis situations of recent decades? Do you have the impression that we have lived up to our global responsibility and our responsibility towards the people in need of protection in our society? And where would you like to see better cooperation between politics, science, business, and society? Thank you very much, Mr. Edel, ladies and gentlemen. Today, too, I listened to the panel discussing the lessons from the pandemic, successes and failures. And those who want to change something now, of course, emphasize what was not successful, because there is such a window of opportunity after a crisis to say, where do we need to change things? This is something I do understand, and this applies internationally. When I think of the impact on the pandemic, for example, initially, however, I would say this idea that we have global responsibility is something the German policymakers had adopted very much. It is embarrassing enough that we have to remind people of the fact that existential crises require a global answer. Otherwise, they would not be existential. A punctual problem is as such not existential, and there is no existential issue whether it's climate or other things. Is there any punctual answer? So America first, Germany first, whoever first will always lag behind the challenge. And in Germany, this was very strongly developed. When I remind of the fact that when the administration retracted from the WHO, Germany and other EU members stood in also with considerable funds, then this was based on the awareness that we say the pandemic can only be counted if it's counted everywhere. This was a broad consensus in Germany. Those on the right-wing side who think Germany first may have denied that there was a pandemic, so they may not have taken part in this discourse but refused to join it. But in Germany there was this consensus. And because science, it has something to do with science, civil society and policymaking. I found it impressive that when COVAX was founded, this instrument for distributing vaccines around the world, there was a commission of the EU, Ursula von der Leyen invited to it. The American administration was not part of it. However, the second speech was given by the president of the National Academy of Medicine of the US. That is, the civil society, science, in a way, stood in as representative of its nation, representing the strength when the politicians moved out. So the global south is very right to say they experienced it in a different way. We did not experience that everyone thought about us, but rather that on the bottom line, this solidarity was not granted. And we now take a look at Geneva and the negotiations on the pandemic treaty. The question is, you, with your instruments in the northern countries, you are saying fast access to the data you always need if there is an outbreak somewhere in the world. And we say you get the data, but we actually finally also want fair access to what was found out with these data. So my conviction is the Germans, in a broad political consensus, got aware of this broad responsibility. The experience in the poorer states of the South was a different one, namely one of not of fair and equal access. Now, allow me 2 comments on the situation in Germany when it comes to lessons learned from that. And I don't want to focus on the individual aspect of a concrete crisis. When was a vaccine ordered and masks bought? But what we have to learn in general. Then there are things which are ubiquitous. The crisis reveals weaknesses we've always seen. For example, the lack of digitization of our state apparatus, etc. In the crisis, this becomes particularly evident. It's a technical and investment question, and other, I believe we have to, and by looking at not just one type of crisis, we need to take a look at the strengths and weaknesses of a federal structure. The state that first the federal chancellor headed a meeting of the ministers president, which partly talked about numbers of square meters in retail for opening of the supermarkets. I mean, this was dealt with by the crisis staff was not what we want. We are thinking about a cross-cutting crisis team that is across federal, states, local, etc. Well, because we don't know, is the next crisis a cyber attack or a virus? So looking forward, but what I find in the intervention protection law, so what the Constitutional Court also said is this is what is it parliaments have to find out, what is relevant for the fundamental rights and what is the scope of action of the executive, whether what we had in the Infection Protection Act for a certain temporary period could be enshrine that into emergency regulations and also exercise that in at peacetime. And the last point, there was wide deliberations among the scientists. For the scientists, I think the biggest and new challenge was to be an advisor to the public with all this hostility around. So not just advisor to individual ministries, but from podcasts to the point where the public was advised. After the change in government, the federal chancellor installed a firm group of persons. Thereby, there was also the discussion, is that arbitrary? Do they pick the people they like, the petitions? Professor Krömer, the head of the Charité Hospital, proposed something like the SAGE, Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies in the UK, so a standing committee for all crises. And I think Susan Mitchie was quoted a while ago. The government in Downing Street, if they don't listen to you, well, it may be of limited use. But still, the idea of pre-structured scientific advice, whether it's for health risks or other risks, in the UK it's all risks, this is certainly something which can help during a crisis because certain rules of the game have already been sorted out, even if every crisis looks different.
That's a very interesting aspect. I would like to ask some questions, because we discussed this also in the recent panel. Jürgen Renn was there, one of the participants. He is dealing with climate change and other interferences in the world, in the global system. And he said during the last crisis, the cooperation of scientists at global level worked quite well. We learned quite quickly how we can cooperate, what kind of virus it is, how can we get access to data, how can we support each other. So to respond very quickly to the crisis from the scientific point of view. Unfortunately, in the social sciences, that was coming with a delay because we were lacking the data. Would that also be a function of science? Because it always, even between parties at war, they always acted globally and bridged those gaps. Couldn't they work as a mediator in such mechanisms? Well, science, like SAGE in England, is really raising the point that they are advising, they are not deciding. But as the president, I mentioned the president of the National Academy who took part in a European conference, kind of as a deputy of his government. I'm very impressed by this scientific community. And as a lawyer, I'm especially impressed that in human sciences, this is even more pronounced. The human body and the nature surrounding us, for the researchers in China, in Germany, in Africa. It's all the same. And with national economists or lawyers or others, this is different. They do not have automatically this joint basis of research. So that was very impressive indeed. But first, we have been discussing this in liberal and democratic societies in Europe against the background of free science. We've got other regions in the world. Just remember the quarrel about the origin of the virus, where freedom of access to data is limited and restricted. The other thing is that you need regulations to make it work very quickly. I'm happy if one lesson was drawn from Ebola with CP, a coalition of pandemic preparedness innovations was founded back then. And this research alliance could then be given a framework where now they could discuss the cooperation between industry, open access to data, and other rules of the games in times of peace. Um, so science can, of course, be a forerunner in this respect, but being a trailblazer also means how to put the political framework, how you organize the exchange rules for data exchange. So many people think that questions of health can be regulated at the national level. And if there is some money left, you can also go international. The fact that vaccination against flu is working in Berlin is due to the safe transfer of data from transmitting the first sequence of the virus. That does not take place in Berlin, in Germany, and not in Europe alone. And I'm just talking about flu vaccination. And I could also mention a lot of other problems. There has to be a framework in place. Freedom of science and the public framework would certainly be a huge progress. You just mentioned the relationship between the federal government and the regional governments in this federal system. That brings me to the question which I would like to ask Antje Draheim. In 2019, you were made the plenipotentiary of the state of Mecklenburg-Western Pomerania at the federal level. And since 2021, you have been a state secretary in the Federal Ministry of Health. So when you look at this, you are really familiar with the pandemic and the associated challenges from the perspective both of the federal states and of the federal government. Sometimes you get the feeling that after the crisis is actually before the crisis. However, no one has noticed this. Infection rates are rising sharply again at this moment. COVID and influenza are being joined by a wave of respiratory diseases since autumn this year. And we also should be worried about climate change, which is increasingly making itself felt in the health sector, especially elderly people. Those with existing conditions are particularly at risk from extreme weather events. At the same time, you know, the present debate, we have to reform our healthcare system so that it can cope with these challenges. I think cooperation between federal government and the regional governments, is it really crisis proof, or is there still room for maneuvering and room for improvement? And what is the role of European global crisis preparedness in this healthcare policy? Well, let me thank you for having me, and a warm welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I could perhaps fill the whole evenings talking about this subject, but only after Mr. Gröhe has really talked about this the whole evening. We know each other from my previous role, so let me tell you, we certainly were sitting on the Committee of Climate Protection, both, and so we meet each other again and again in different roles. I'm happy to say this at this place. And Mr. Gröhe has also pointed out that federalism may indeed give rise to some thinking about how to deal with such things in the future. I rather assume that federalism finally has been the the organization which speeded up the vaccination process from a central point of view that would never have been achieved. So that brings us back to the old subject, which we had already in the 90s during the federalism reform. How can we improve checks and balances better than before? Of course, we as the federal government are asking ourselves, indeed, with two sides of the dilemma, because I'm also working for the regional state of Western Mecklenburg from Western Pomerania. I think it's an interesting development. First of all, I have noticed that obviously everyone has found out what the weak points were and where we improved over time in this very special one crisis. I think it's helpful if you sometimes have things closely before your eyes rather than getting the abstract explanation and preparing yourself for an abstract case. What were the consequences in cooperation? I can't mention everything, but just some examples. One was started already during the pandemic. That was the Pact for Public Health Service, which I think is fundamentally important, and as well as the findings about across public health disciplines, that public health is not just a marginal subject, but a central one. And I think rarely we had such a window of opportunity in the health business where the focus was so strongly put on public health conditions. Second thing was also mentioned by Mr. Gröhe, the whole thing, subject of digitization. Well, a very German subject, if I may say so. I really sincerely hope that the rest of the world is much better than us. At least that's my anecdotic or empiric impression. We could really be clearer, more advanced, and at least we managed to have to channel two digital laws. On the one hand, the law about using research data, which gives us access to research data as we need. And the second one is the electronic patients file and electronic use of data of inpatient and outpatient healthcare for the stationary, for the inpatient sector. That is also a central subject and not an easy one, because all the service providers have to be connected to the system. That costs a lot of nerves and a lot of money, we know that, but I think it's extremely necessary. At the same time, however, it also puts our focus on data access. We are very much putting a lot of focus on data protection and privacy. This is not very easy. And sometimes we also call it that data are also a treasure, because we get a lot of findings out of that. And especially for science during the pandemic, questions of evidence and data were so important for everything we are doing now. So I think that this is also a point where which we should drive much more. There are two other laws in the pipeline for this year, which I hope we can channel this year together, at least when it comes to networking of data available to the government. And I'm a little bit more concerned about things. We have to get also the trust of the population for on our way. That's not an easy task. And to explain it to everyone why it's good to use these data. And This morning I visited a private doctor's office. Sometimes that happens to us as well. There were 10 people queuing up for just getting the prescription. And the staff told them that there was an electronic prescription now in place and that they don't get the paper. They did not really understand that this works with the healthcare card right now. And this was interesting. Now, of course, the staff in the practitioners' offices is really explaining the whole day how the system works. And I apologize, actually, I can't even visit the doctor without being recognized by the people. But those are the essential points. One thing is to create the infrastructure, but the other part is that you also have to take on board all the citizens. That is a very important point. We mentioned science as well already. Well, SAGE would be nice. That, of course, something very positive. We are working on it. At the regional level in Mecklenburg, we also had such an expert staff, which was the country was benefiting from. And however, as politicians and as society, we have to ask ourselves, how do we handle different scientific opinions or findings, or when things are not clear? Yes, when do we really have reached the level of evidence? That was a discussion I had very often. Um, and for instance, the Robert Koch Institute, they always were calling upon telling us, well, evidence is not complete yet. This is also something, and we haven't found a solution yet to that point. And science, as Mr. Gröhe has mentioned, scientists also always say, we provide the data, but you are the one to decide. And to explain this to the population, that it's important to work that way and to separate the two things from each other, and also with all those different scientific opinions to find the right political impact. That's not a trivial job. So I think there is much more work to be done, because we could see that we could not gain the trust of the population everywhere. And so I think it remains a very difficult subject. Cooperation between the national government and the regional governments. We had, of course, bodies which had been there all the time. There is no reason to dissolve them. It's rather important to strengthen these links. There is now also a body for crisis coordination, which is much more than the one we had for disaster management in the past. We are in a good way also with regard to the law about ensuring healthcare. Let's see to which level we can take it. I think we are quite good at it so far. The question is also, how do we provide stocks? What is civil protection? What is crisis protection? How do we define a crisis at all? What is a health crisis, etc.? Those are all no simple questions. And by far, it's not the case that we are free of crises, apart from the normal reform work. Sorry, but also the hospital reform is an ordinary political job. It's not a crisis in as such. It's just something which we have to complete in terms of infrastructure. But when I'm talking about crisis, I'm referring to the Ukraine war, which of course affects our health care system. We have to coordinate. We also installed a crisis group which coordinates the needs better than we had before, when each one was doing this individually. We have not reached the end of this way yet. And I think it's also wise to continue the discussion. And I also listen to Lily, how we can take on board a civil economy, how can we improve the dialogue. That's a very important point to me too. And just that should suffice as a first impact. We are also now restructuring the Center of Healthcare Education, because we found out that that has very much linked to the question how the population perceives health. And when we look at the situation of Germany as a Western European country in this sector, I would think there is some homework to be done, and that also is linked to the fact that the population is not knowledgeable enough about their own health condition, and they are not competent enough to get information and to understand also the sense or nonsense of the prevention offers. That's perhaps a subject which we should which we feel under demographic points of view, because we all want to become older. And for us, or for me personally, I'm interested in getting older but healthy in any case. And if that continues for more years, even better. That's the message. But this is also something where we have to work. And the main factor is communication with the population in this respect. That shall do for the moment. Thank you very much. The nice thing about demography is someone is called it the beauty of democracy, that you always have this positive view. You get older, you get more healthy overall. If that's individually true, one cannot say. But regarding the data, you really can also just praise and encourage the German government to be more active in this respect, because for a very long time we didn't have reliable data, reliable statements. My favorite anecdote is that once in the Bild Zeitung, somebody in front of his house took a photo with his age and he protested against Google Street View, but he provided the picture with all his geographical data, with his identity data. So that is a rather bizarre relationship, how people are dealing with their own privacy data. On the one hand, they provide all the data to Netflix and other channels and other players. But when it comes to health data, which actually are needed during the pandemic, even in an anonymized way to help, they were really reluctant to provide such data. Another aspect which you mentioned is that we have to explain politics better. So that measures have to be understood better, but there also should be provided more understanding of what politics really means. It means that we are competing against each other. That is normal, that the federal government and the regional governments are competing by their ideas against each other or with each other. Rather have the opinion, could see this, that people perceive this as a deficit. And the same goes for science. You remember that many people mentioned, well, authoritarian states, they can manage because there's only one to decide. Now let's look. This is really enlightening. And the president of the Max Planck Society also said recently they failed completely. And now perhaps we have to tell people that democracy has its strength in discourse, and that is also something which we see in the discourse between the federal government and the regional governments. Or may this be an obstacle? No, I don't think so. But I was positively surprised indeed of ourselves that we managed quite well to um, work across within this democratic spectrum across the borders of regional governments, even though sometimes it was rather bizarre, like Mr. Gröhe has described. I understand it, it's difficult, but maybe that was also good to show this in public, how we are discussing and how difficult it is to decide. Well, everyone can try on his own to think what they would say if they were part of such a round, and what kind of decision they would take when it, for instance, when it comes to the square meters of a job. But that's not the point. In fact, it was relatively quickly that they joined and made decisions. Not everyone may have liked those decisions. Sometimes they were not easy. Sometimes they were also taken back. More than one time. It was a very lively pandemic, and even 2 or 3 days later, after taking the decisions, you were wiser and you had to change the decision again. That was the situation like. Maybe it's also a question of the parliamentary democracy. We thought a long time about what participation processes are like. There are some federal states which have more democratic elements. There are some who have less. There is a citizens council. There are several models which are being tried. That's wise, in my opinion. On the other hand, it's also, I'm not fully decided, and it's not my political statement. What I'm going to tell you now is just my observation that many people are using different channels for information, and everyone theoretically has the opportunity to get access to a lot of available knowledge. And so they form their own opinion. Maybe 50 years ago, that was different, where you did not have access to such global information. How many people all of a sudden have read scientific journals during the pandemic? Dr. Google is now in standing term in Germany. That's fascinating indeed. But of course, that also results to a certain extent that people are questioning parliamentary politics a bit more and really doubting it. So you are right, we have to explain politics in a different way. Maybe we also have to organize ourselves in a different way. That's also an interesting idea to say, why is it valuable to have politicians who may take decisions in your behalf? So otherwise, you could decide it on your own. Why do maybe it's an advantage to have this federal structure during the last, even during my active years, we had major changes in our federal system. It obviously seems to be a working system without producing many distortions, and the population is actually joining that way. That is also a point which is worthwhile thinking about. How do we manage to better explain the political decision-making process and to bring across this and to involve to get it linked to the information behavior of the population? That's an interesting point which I would like to raise here. Okay, thank you. That brings me quite nicely to my next question, which I would like to ask Secretary General Georg Schütte. Communication and science, you've been involved in these two areas since your journalistic training and doctorate in media and communication sciences, and later at the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation. Um, Also, during your time as State Secretary at the Federal Ministry of Education and Research, you provided important initiatives and impetus to the subject of science communication. The Volkswagen Foundation also attaches great importance to the interface between science and practice, for example, in the social transformations profile area. Where do you see the greatest challenges in improving interaction between science and politics as institutional factors in crisis management? Let me just join the last remarks, but also the initial statement of the two separate worlds. Once you have understood the basic logics of action in politics, in science, and also in the media, if you really put it to the point, in science, it's about producing truth, but only temporary truth, findings which are valid and working for a certain time. In politics, let me just pass on the water. In politics, it's about power. It's about imposing one's own positions in competitions and in mutual fighting. And in media, it's about getting the news across and a change versus a prior situation. Those are the basic logics. And then when we speak about crisis, the logic still works. And but we have to say, what does it mean to have a crisis? Crisis is standing for a term where systems may be disrupted, they stop working, and they don't fit anymore. You quoted Ms. Jürgen Renn. We are living in a period of Anthropocene, and in the long run, we can see that there are creeping crises where we can see some tipping points: climate crisis, diversity crisis, and he even goes that far to say that the current crises are actually induced by this. Wars are resulting from the lack of water resources and land resources, and then the system is tipping. And now we have to ask, if crises are so diverse, Jürgen Renn is mentioning the term of polycrisis. One crisis follows the next one. After the pandemic, the Ukraine war, then we speak about climate change and the question on how to ensure energy provision in the future. If in such periods of polycrisis, we have to ask whether the old division of work is still working. The ideal type is that scientists try to set the course for action and provide politicians with options for action, and then the politicians may decide. I think we have seen that this might be an ideal, but in times of such a diverse crisis, none of them can really do the trick alone. And we have to recalibrate the whole system. And that means for scientists that they have to make available totally different time for of knowledge, types of knowledge, orientation knowledge, describing crisis phenomena, to develop a logic. What happens when we think about climate change? What do we have to do? And the second category is systematic knowledge. When we speak about diverse crises, how does it work within the systems? How do we handle to this? How does a healthcare system work when affected by an epidemic or pandemic? How this may go wrong, we could see during the COVID crisis. In the first stage, it was expert knowledge on an unsafe basis, which caused radical restrictions of public life. And we found out in the second phase, when we had a much wider view of on the whole system, we could not just think in a dimensional way, but we also had to solve the problems for the education system, for healthcare system, for attention to elderly people. Knowledge about systems as a second category is very important. And the third one is transformation knowledge. We need expertise also from science for the changes within these systems. And it means that science may also be included in the pre-political discourse. The ideal type that one group is there and the other one may decide. Scientists have to build bridges also for politicians. And the second remark, the two areas have to explain themselves. You mentioned politicians have to explain themselves. People have to understand better how the political processes work. During the COVID crisis, we learned also that scientists have to find better explanations. They have to explain better that scientists are producing science and knowledge, and they may also review or revise certain findings. And this became very clear during the COVID crisis. It is a temporary knowledge. Time was of the essence. And so the scientists did not just discuss in the established journals with their peers, where everyone looks on the data and on the right conclusions. During the pandemic, scientists started to publish their outcome already in pre-publications in order to and then review evidence in a very short period of time. That's, of course, prone to risks. And scientists have to explain themselves in order to explain also that their findings are of limited value, not only the way of action at the political arena, but also a better knowledge about how scientists are acting. That is also necessary. And then, of course, we also need transfer mechanisms. And what we learned is that how expert bodies in politics can be functional and some may not be functional, but it is obvious that the rooms for action and thinking in the scientific world are totally different than in politics. Scientists are thinking in the long run, and politicians have to decide for now. And of course, there are some limits where even scientists cannot help, but where they have to struggle in the political process. But even there, you have to have a chance for revision. And that's what we could see in the pandemic. However, it's getting difficult if revisions are then starting to moralize. That was a third level in the pandemic. First, they had a very clear position. Then the systemic thinking came in, and then moral came in. And then it was really difficult. That makes it also very difficult for politics. So you mentioned basic logics, and I could see this also in the pandemic, that we cannot understand each other because we have to live in different basic logics. We have very long production cycles in science. We have peer reviews. We have an international process that all takes time. And when we come up too early with the findings, that may really damage your reputation. We could see this where even the Leopoldina was attacked. Was coming under attack because they came up with findings which were not well founded. And you might know this from President Truman. I think you have heard about this already. He said once he wishes a scientific advisor with only one arm so that they can't say on the one hand and on the other hand. but I'm even not sure whether he really said this. But it shows very clearly that our way of shedding light on certain things has, where we consider things from different angles of view, is sometimes not in line with the political processes. I have a colleague in the House of who visited the House of Representatives and watched a hearing there, where the delegates were asking, "Well, I don't know 100% whether it's this way or that way." So then he said, "We don't know why you're here." So people want them to have a clear statement, one truth, and that's it. What I'm saying by this is, and I would like to link this to the question, there is also this way. First of all, we have to understand the logic of systems, and then there are more and more possibilities to say that to link this already in the production process, to work interdisciplinarily. So basically, not only scientists have to work alone, already in the generation of projects, they have to take on board the civil society, the politicians by dialogue formats, and to develop this. Would you agree with that?
Yes, but I would do that in a more differentiated way. There are a number of questions that emerge out of science, and we afforded to ourselves that experts in science are there to do exactly this, namely to try to disseminate that and bring that on a broader basis. This will not work. If, on the other hand, we think about that, besides open-ended research, which is based on curiosity and science, if besides this research direction, we also ask the question based on the many facets of research questions, which are the relevant ones for people to address them, then we have to talk to those affected. This is also an option so that a scientific agenda of what is processed can be enriched. A second phase of participation then consists in scientific knowledge to be made relevant for policymaking and for the public. To do that past people is also extremely disturbing. And this basically demonstrates one gap we have in the German scientific advisory system. We have quite a range of early warning systems, including think tanks, and the Leopoldina and other institutions are part of that. But they often work along the old ideal of the separation. We make options available, and the others are supposed to do something with them. The policymakers then act, but the stretch between which options will have which consequences, and these consequences to be pre-discussed so that at the level of policymaking, one can act with better information. This is a stage we have not yet reached, as opposed to the US, for example, where there is a range of think tanks who indeed put up political options for action to the debate. We are lacking that, and this also means the politicians are stretched. If we were in a position to close this gap in a discourse where think tanks are in touch with different stakeholders from the broader field of societal interests, then I think we would get to a different quality of political decision-making. I can only underscore that a lot, and nothing is as difficult as formulating policy recommendations accepted by both parts. That is, the politicians have to regard them as helpful enough and the scientists as scientific enough. Now, this is a good segue to Paul Dykstra. I would like to switch to English now.
You're one of Europe's leading demographers and empirical sociologists with a focus on intergenerational solidarity, aging societies, family change, aging and the life course, and loneliness. At the same time, as I already mentioned, you have been a member of the group of chief scientific advisors to the cabinet of the European Commissioners from 2015 to 2019, and to the European Commission as part of the so-called scientific advice mechanism of the European Union. Last October, we discussed in Brussels at a conference various aspects of science policy, of the science policy interface with policymakers and experts. Based on your experience during the pandemic, where do you see the scientific limitations and the limits of scientific knowledge and responsibility towards politics and society? And why is that so important for demographers?
Danke für die Einladung. Ich werde Englisch sprechen. Ich kann Deutsch verstehen, aber nicht so gut sprechen. I think the fact that that conference was there was a very important event. It was organized by the JRC, the Joint Research Committee, and it was about how can countries, and I mean all European countries, how can they improve their science advice system? And following up what you said, Herr Schütte, I think it's very important to distinguish science and the body of science, and what do we know and what don't we know, and how good is the quality, and then the science advice. And what we attempted to do in Brussels very strongly is to make that bridge explicit. So we have a body of knowledge. It's not a full, I mean, we could criticize it, but given that body of knowledge, and then given, and we would make it very explicit, particular principles. And then Europe was wonderful because Europe has the Charter of Human Rights. Given principles like dignity or the access to accessible healthcare, for example, or gender equality, or principles of equality, we would say, given such and such principles, and given the policy context, because that's crucial, you have to know something about the policy context, knowing that it'll fit either the policymaker's agenda or the structure of the policymakers. Is an evaluation coming? Well, then you can tailor your recommendations, with, of course, without losing your independence. And I know about the Leopoldina. The Leopoldina still thinks we have an excellent body of knowledge and we then give it to the policymakers. Whereas I think a better model is you might have a question. It might be a political question. Well, we're not going to deal with a political question, but maybe we can help change that political question into something where science can help you. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question because you wanted to know about the limits. And I'm very loath to talk about limits. It's true we weren't prepared during the pandemic. One of the reasons is that we weren't prepared sufficiently to go across disciplinary borders, or what you say, knowledges. I very much liked your term knowledges. What we didn't do sufficiently from the start is take into account practical knowledge. The people who are standing with their boots in COVID treatments. So that's something, okay, we can look back on it and we didn't do well. We didn't do well with dealing across disciplines. That's not easy. But to learn each other's language, and now, as Herr Gröhe said, the peacetime, we can hopefully develop systems where we learn to speak each other's language. I'm working in something called the Pandemic Disaster Preparedness Center. If we use the word model, a day later we still haven't agreed. But it's crucial to work across disciplines. And a point I want to suggest, if you have policy advice that's based on a wide range of disciplines, it will, and that's a point you made, it will engender trust by the politicians, but also the citizens. And of course, that's the group that we're working for. Something, and that's a point you made, is the limitations of data infrastructures. And part of these limitations are pure technical. We have to get them interoperable. And part of them are reluctance to share data. And part of the problems are also this odd interpretation sometimes of the general data protection regulations. But we have to work on it now so that'll be improved. Another difficulty we faced is that the pandemic was viewed very much from national countries, whereas patients are patients. And yes, there are certain circumstances. I know migrant groups might be specific to a particular country, but to actually work together across disciplines but also across countries, that's something that we have to organize now, instead of being so insular and so focused upon ourselves. And that has everything to do with the competitive spirit that we often work in. Crucial too, when we're disseminating knowledge, is to be open and transparent about uncertainties. What do we know? What don't we know? Why is there a difference of opinion? Can we identify that? And we have to communicate the uncertainty to the politicians. The politicians have to understand the uncertainty so that they can communicate that well to the public. And believe me, it's easier said than done. And being open about the evidence base makes it possible for other scientists to not criticize, but possibly criticize, but also to publicly assess the knowledge, because that's how science works. It's not, this is our package. Science is always developing. And this public assessment will also be informative to the public, because they can see where the scientists are coming from, but also to get an understanding of how science works.
Thanks a lot. It's really a wonderful panopticon of this challenge we have in front of us.
Oh, yeah.
You didn't answer to my last question. What is the relevance of demography?
Oh, yes. Well, demography has been called, and I love this, an interdiscipline.
Yes.
I forget the author, it was in the 70s. So demography, by its subject matter, there's the health, there's the statistics, there's the geography, there's the anthropology, the psychology, the sociology. That's what makes demography a wonderful field. Demography is used to dealing with uncertainty. I mean, think of all the forecasts. And I think what's also relevant is that demography also has to think about speeding up its data collections. And there are ways of doing it. And fortunately, in the pandemic, all kinds of new methods were tried about using existing panels. Of course, that's what demographers are good about. They are representative, solid panels where you have the history. But to really quickly improve data collections is also something that we can trust the demographers.
Das war jetzt der kleine Werbeslot für das.
All right, this was the little pitch, so to say, for demography, but that's allowed. I've got one question that directly follows up to the two politicians. Initially, perhaps to Mr. Gröhe. How do you deal with uncertainty if a scientist comes to you and says, I mean, always one says one wants one figure, one percentage for 2 or 3 policy recommendations, no more than a page. But when you say, we don't know exactly, how do you deal with that? Well, probably there is no very general answer to this question either. Of course, the wish is that there is the broadest possible foundation of well-evidenced facts. Up until this date, we still have people denying the climate crisis. There may even be some people who deny what has become a very widespread consensus. The next thing is, part of the scientific body of knowledge quickly becomes the object of a political dispute. Let me give you an example from the COVID crisis. The irresponsible, one would even say hate speech against vaccination, then there is a risk that in order to make a strong point against that, and I would say all politicians and scientists involved were wise enough to formulate such that they can now prove that in sentence 10, the footnote with the residual risks was included. But when you ask someone who suffered from a vaccination, he will say, you all said it's not dangerous, because the debate about the natural size finding, as to which residual risks are there, were part of that dispute, object of that dispute. And here I think it's very difficult. Politicians certainly have a hard time to confess what they don't know. Whereas the strong wording Jens Spahn used, we will have to pardon each other a lot, says something of the pressure of decision-making. It's sometimes off the mark. Only Trump always wanted to be right, and this is why it didn't work out at all. Frequently, the finding of what damage does it do or how useful is it. So we also dispute about that. So the dispute of the Democrats cannot be put to a scientific colloquium. Of course, Mr. Schütte, it would be very simplified to say, here are the advisors, there are the policymakers, here's the civil society that influences policymakers. Sure, this is very clear, but certain decisions, which are also judgment-based at the end, must be made transparent by the politicians without being able to eliminate them. If I may add one thing, dealing with uncertainty. I learned that from you, Mr. Gröhe, even before COVID and after Ebola. I think it was with the G7 health ministers, you ran a simulation, an exercise, G20. We did make that drill. You have to have that drill regularly, not just at policymaking, but also at implementation level. But the idea was indeed that the RKI and the WHO helped should develop materials, if I'm allowed to say that, also in terms of the group dynamics, a very exciting process. I think it's not a secret if I say there was just one G20 country, namely China, that in such a war game always managed to read out a card, a file card. Everyone else was in the process, and you hear something you haven't already heard 3 times. So it was worthwhile. At this level, like at other levels, we need something. I mean, at the times of Cold War, the West German government regularly went into the Eiffel bunker. I mean, they said we have to have drills, and this is indeed what we need. Drills, not just at technical, but also at policymaking level. Very interesting aspect. That through that you'd have a simulation and war game, and how can that be implemented? The scientists being involved. And if, allow me to be facetious, 2 days, this is what we had. When the next morning, with everyone, and this was in Berlin and Paris plants, we came into a room of a building. Everywhere there were yellow papers displayed, which in a very extreme form, so to say, highlighted what was also on the table, not just the WHO, World Bank, United Nations who were there, but those who had the discussion also had people in front of the door who distributed a yellow paper. And the films are still available for watching. Thank you. Well, that's exciting, I believe. We're still a bit at the beginning. Today, we also have a very great technical possibility. You mentioned Jürgen Rann, who together with American universities develops something and wants to use it that is called decision theater, where one can jointly move into modeling together with scientists and policymakers. I think we can do much more if we accept using modern technologies, which can facilitate interfaces. Well, but in the end, it's people who decide. So yes, the basis for decision making, the data we have, to be understood this way. I mean, you made the point very validly. It's not just about having data, but also interpreting them. And if you go to a 9th form in the school and ask them about statistics, I might as well say go to the age cohort of the 40-year-olds and ask them about statistics. It's a huge issue, a true problem. And unfortunately, I'm sorry to say that at this point, it's not an elective subject. It should be part of it. But stochastics and statistics is the first thing that is deselected at the grammar schools and universities. Still, it's important for all disciplines, not just demography, but also for epidemiology. So we don't make it because people haven't learned to have that understanding, and we cannot reproach them with that. It's just a gap in knowledge we have to fill, I believe. And then you can interpret it very soberly, first of all, and then you can develop an opinion that this is not the same. It's also something we have to practice. This is a very important point too. And as to uncertainty, well, you can look at that from several angles. Politology, economy, the lawyers are always safe. They always have 5 opinions in themselves and can still decide it. I can say that because I'm a lawyer myself, so well, fine. That was at my own expense. But the key point is, of course, we never get uncertainty to 0. particularly not in crisis. Rather, it will grow, and it will grow over time. Like you said, the factor of time constantly changes what we know. So the hope, which is very nice, is that uncertainty could be reduced further, is treacherous. I mean, it's wrong. It's not my experience, and it's not that this did not take place. I mean, in my state, Mecklenburg, Western Pomerania, and others, there were expert teams which were composed with great variation. I was in the social ministry at that time. We had the youth welfare on board, the pediatricians, all kinds of groups. So everyone who was into care, whoever was around there in the field was involved. The the State Office for Health, modeling experts from the university in Greifswald, etc. So this was broadly discussed, namely, what do we know, what don't we know, and what does it mean? And then everyone offered their perspective. And then it's definitely of advantage if you're a lawyer. Namely, it is about weighing interests against each other. And this happened. And this is indeed what we have to get better at explaining. It's not about this being right or that being wrong. Is it correct to close down childcare facilities with a view, for example, to the risk of contagion to other family members? Or is it not right with a view to the long-term consequences resulting for kids from that? This is just a matter of weighing these things, and to stand up and bear it is also an art. Politicians have to be able to exercise, and also all other stakeholders, and also something we have to explain better to the people. And once this has been explained, you rather see faces which look a bit embarrassed. I did the same in my family. You know, when you are a co-decider, you're also asked, why do you do this now? What are you up to? And then you explain it. And then they say, fortunately, it's you doing this, not me. So this is the classic answer. And maybe this is another thing, under the headline of bridge, that we resolve this contradiction. How can we do it better together? It's not that the policymakers would not have liked to have more support during these times. This is a very important point, as I believe. Uncertainty is something you have to stand, you have to accept, and I believe one has to take a sober look at what the options are. In crises, uncertainty is higher. It's wrong to believe we could reduce that to a relevant extent. This is my personal view. The second thing is, it's also not so bad if we table all options, see them, and decide together in the scope of a reasonable weighing process. So the parliamentarians must be involved. This was one of the criticisms. How far were the limitations to them? In this case, there were limitations. And to what extent is health protection more important than individual freedom? These are questions which are not trivial. And it's also nice training in democracy for the population and also for the policymakers to ascertain time and again, I'm part of the executive, then there's the parliament, then there is the voter, the citizens, and how do they relate to each other? And I think this was also good to see and experience. Thank you so much for this food for thought. I mean, often I am often mentally looking into this problem. How can we explain uncertainty as a concept or risk as a concept? And how can decisions come about on that basis? Sometimes, I mean, you talked about weighing. This is a legal term, weighing up of choices or balancing of interests. This is, of course, a term pondered often. Balancing of competing interests. An economist might call that a risk assessment. I'm a historian by trade, but when you say, okay, I have to assess risks, everyone of us who has ever modestly invested in the stock market knows about that. I don't know the whole or full picture. I have to have some weighing. I have a certain measure of information. I can enhance that, and this is the space science occupies. But in the end of the day, it's me who decides, do I run a risk or not? And I think we can explain that to the population, and what you said was right. This must be done at school. We have to tell children there's no yes and no. You always have to make decisions where you have to weigh things. What do I win? What do I lose? How big is the damage I cause? High gain, high risk. That is the fundamental principle for all Max Planck institutes. Can I chime in? This weighing, you know, I run a risk. Let me take this difficult topic of the obligation to get vaccinated. There are vaccinations like for measles where it's clear my behavior is relevant for third parties. So it's not like that. And it's often, so, you know, when I drive without a belt, it's not just me who's in danger, but also others in traffic, in road traffic. But at the moment where a mutation has it that vaccination protection cannot unfold this third-party action, which that is, it's a natural science finding, first of all, the question whether vaccination protects just me or the community, which also taught us that health is not just individual, but an asset of the public. At that moment, the right to intervene with my freedoms must be seen from a different perspective, because thinking of measles, this is corroborated much more in terms of third-party protection than if there is when it's just about one's own protection. But at the beginning is the assessment of this mutation and that vaccine. And then the weighing, what is the risk we are talking about? The one I run as an individual or one that also affects all of you?
When I used the word uncertainty, I used it in a broader sense, at least I was hoping, than just the risk assessment. Risk assessment is very typical for ecology and for epidemiology. I think it's also important to understand uncertainty in the sense of you might have a measure, but it's not entirely, here we get into causality. Will it have the expected effect? And there's also a kind of uncertainty that comes from the way a problem has been addressed. Has it been, what kind of method has been used, or is it only from one particular discipline? And that's why I liked Antje's example of the kindergartens. I mean, you have the social consequences, the health consequences, et cetera, and that's also what I meant with uncertainty. So not to just narrow it down to the typical risk assessment that is important, and it's particularly important when we're talking about something that concerns our health. But I wanted to use a broader concept of uncertainty, and I see you nodding.
Sie sind natürlich auch herzlich eingeladen, Fragen an das Podium zu stellen. Sie haben noch eine gute Viertelstunde. Also wenn sich jemand zu Wort melden möchte, ich würde auch die Technik dann bitten, die Q&A vielleicht auf den Bildschirm zu spielen.
Ask the tech team to play the Q&A to the screen so that I can see whether anyone from the internet wants to ask a question. So if you're interested, please go to the mic and ask a question. Otherwise, I would just like to continue very cheekily, so to say. Oh, here's I'm Alamanca. I'm just here as in my private capacity. I may represent the citizens here. We talked about the top level, the policymakers and the scientists. Let's say they talk to each other, they reached a conclusion that affects all citizens, and who was to implement that? The doctors. They, for example, had to vaccinate or not. Even though the doctors have been trained in similar ways over many years, it suddenly turned out that they have totally different standpoints. Many, of course, joined that vaccination move, but many also said, hey, that's nonsense. There are other factors. There are no viruses. Even professors said that publicly. And this means that the first problem is if the policymakers then decided some measure, one would, in the next pandemic, so to say, have to assume that it doesn't arrive on the bottom line, or at the grassroots level, rather. So how many percentage points more fatal effects are there? At the beginning, you don't know because these data are not yet there. You only know that after a certain while. And so these measures may be futile because some of the people say, okay, it's not so bad, we don't need to do that. And so there is no possibility to effectively enforce that in the end of the day. And to build the bridge to demography, it would be such that from today's viewpoint, one probably knows several measures which make you more healthy in old age, but whether there is really a uniform opinion of scientists, I don't know. even if there was such a uniform opinion, it's not the case that the government says, yes, but we pay you, citizens, through the health funds. No, at the moment, it's only people who can pay that themselves can do that, because for the health insurance funds, it would probably be too expensive in the long run if they had to pay some pills for everyone every day. The prerequisite to that would, of course, be that one agreed among the scientists that there are these pills which are indeed having an effect.
I hope it's not just a pill, at least that's important to me, because maybe we misunderstood each other and I have to explain better. When I'm talking about prevention, I do not necessarily refer to the therapy after a diagnosis. That's actually what we are doing today. You have a diagnosis first, and then you have a condition and a medicine or a therapy. Actually, we should start earlier by changing the way of life, by providing other information how to deal with oneself, so that certain diagnosis is avoided from the onset. Of course, this is not going to be possible for everyone, but when we really think of the subject which is now very current, for instance, cardiovascular diseases, that has a lot to do on how we estimate ourselves. And that's a very important point. And the second point is, yes, indeed, you addressed this also among healthcare practitioners. You have to make sure that you also get the trust of your own industry. That's very important. You are right. On the other hand, the to my mind, during the COVID pandemic, we did have enough doctors who were ready to vaccinate people. It was rather the question, how fast would you vaccinate, which target group, what are the intervals? So from the onset, that was rather limited discussions due to the availability of the vaccines. Now the discussion is who is ready to vaccinate their patients and who is not. That's rather an ethical debate within the group of practitioners. Maybe one or the other doctors may be present here and would like to join this discussion. It's I actually I'm not in a position to provide an ethical decision that would go against my own understanding. That's what I said before. We have to balance goods against each other, and I sincerely hope that the patient, that the health practitioner really looks at the patient's individual and he tells the patient that it's your risk, and if you want, I'm vaccinating you. If you don't want, I don't. So actually, that's the ethical decisions. And when we look at the COVID pandemic or a very special health care condition, we should also take into account the effects on the whole populations. And you are right, that needs to be more specified, and I take this home. I thought he addressed me in the first place, so that's why I answered. There was another one asking for the floor. I'm the chairman of the German Hospital Society. I would like to speak about the pandemic, but a little bit more extended. We heard before that crisis resilience has been discussed always in a situation where we feel especially uncertain. We are generally always in a relatively uncertain situation, but it was especially an especially uncertain situation. And it's not only about the good cooperation between scientists and healthcare practitioners. It always is also necessary that decision makers take decision. And the same goes for us in the industry. Only then you can produce results in a crisis, which at the end of the day provide solutions. Our perception is that we have developed into a situation during the recent years that this readiness for decision making at the political level and also at the level of leadership and management in the industry is going down. On the one hand, because you are afraid of being exposed to the public, whether your decision was right or wrong. And in a company, in the meantime, it affects the subject of complying with all compliance rules, always being on the safe side, always discussing with 5 lawyers before you really take a decision. And that has become much more important than rather the activity of an entrepreneur. And that's a problematic development in my mind, and I would like to have your opinion on that. Or the question, how can we counteract this trend? Because we need agile companies and also politicians who are also ready to take responsibility at the end of the day, and of course to explain themselves. Thank you. That's a very important point. I would like to pass on to you. A colleague of mine of the Oxford University told me that they introduced risk management, and since then, no one was ready to take a risk because they would have been hanged on the next day if they were wrong. So they decided, well, to not to take any risks. Now I'm running risk of provoking, so that we have only one arm. Even due to the fact that I'm also a lawyer, Paracelsus said it's the dose which makes the poison, and politicians, or perhaps also the German tradition, is asking very much for safety, and that also hides a lot of stability. I would say in the first place that Germany is a very complicated political system, but this also ensured a lot of stability. And it's not by coincidence that more than Anglo-Saxon countries, we are much more in love with stability. Because if you have to change, you run the risk of getting immobile. So those are two sides of the coin. There is also something reasonable in that. That in Germany, very few things are decided alone from one level or not even from a certain single position. Up to our electional law, which always forces you into coalitions, and that means also into compromise. The question is this also suitable for a serious crisis under pressure? And I mentioned this at the beginning. Maybe we need a crisis committee across all the disciplines. Do we have to change or introduce something like we had in the infection law? But I would really say for the governments that they did take the necessary decisions. And so when the crisis broke out at the Grand Coalition, they were very much focusing on acting jointly as democrats. So most of the decisions were taken unanimously, and the longer the crisis extended, and this was right, because we had on the one hand the AfD who said there is no virus and we are doing everything wrong, and all other parties would have said we are doing everything right. No, that was not like it was. As the crisis continued, the spectrum became wider, and that's correct. And I think the major challenges, this is a challenge to the population when they go to the polls. On the election day, when we look at the last days of the election, when the governments were formed, there has never been a government where you would see, where you would know on the day of election what the main challenge would be for that government. Look at the present government. No one had an idea of the Ukrainian war when the government was formed, or it was also in the Balkans. In the first place, when you elect a government, you trust that government that in a crisis they will take the right decisions. And if they don't take any decisions, they are rightfully not in the right place. So let me also speak on behalf of the companies. I must say that our foundation is not the foundation of the Volkswagen Group. They were created 22 years ago when Volkswagen was privatized, and the prior owners, federal states and Lower Saxony, had to decide what to do with the money, and so they founded a non-profit foundation. So I can't speak about Volkswagen as a group. But in the companies, in the world of of industry, I think it is especially the new technologies which makes them resistant to change, just coming along with the risk that their business model will fail. The combustion engines and engine producers were really slow in changing their production for electric. I'm seeing in politics, I see a crisis of bureaucracy. They decide by not deciding anymore, and that is not up to date anymore in a time of radical changes. I think this is one of the major challenges of this country. So cutting down bureaucracy and red tape, that is something which prevents also scientists and political decision making and decentralized decision making should not be just allowed, it should really be promoted. And I would even go a bit further that wise people which had been selected in a long process, be it in politics, be it in science, being in the industry, they also should really be given a certain level of trust and responsibility.
About when is decision taken. We're talking about the interface between science and policy, or science advice and policy. Of course, the policymaker, the decision maker, does not have to take the science advice. There might be other consideration, electoral considerations, financial considerations, fine. But what scientists, if they have provided advice and see that their advice is not being heeded, it would be very helpful if the policymaker then says, I take your advice, fine, but for this and this and this reason, I decide not to follow that, because that would very much improve transparency. It would also make it clear to the people he or she serves what the basis for a decision has been. And the same, if advice is heeded, to then say, hey, I followed the advice of A, B, C, and D. Acknowledge the fact that advice from a particular group of scientists has been used. That would really help the relationship between policymakers and scientists.
Ich glaube, wir haben noch Zeit für eine Frage.
Politiker und Entscheidungsträger. Jakob Birk has asked for the floor. There's time for one more statement. Thank you very much. Jakob Birk from Great UK. May I ask?
I found this discussion about uncertainty fascinating. There is a saying by British philosopher Carver Reed, it's better to be broadly right than precisely wrong. And this is something that that sort of brings this home, because when we expect certainty when there is none, chances are we'll go down the wrong path. So this is the reason why, of course, we should be looking at uncertainty and acknowledging and doing risk management and other things. But there is another layer of the problem above it, that now there is this big talk about preparedness, to resilience, preparedness, but this costs resources. To be prepared, you need to be willing, as a decision maker, to put money where your mouth is. So basically, to strengthen the capacity to respond with something concrete, with manpower, with money, with time, with legal framework. How do you think this might work? How do you think the difficult question about adequate resourcing of preparedness would work in your view? How to make this sort of message resonate not only within the world of the politics and policy, because I'm conscious that everyone understands it, but also to portray it to the general public, so that the people, the voters, have a clear and frank picture what can be traded for what. Thank you.
Wer möchte? Hören Sie das mal?
Ja,
I will really remember this saying. It's always the question, what happens? I at least take this consideration. What is if my decision is wrong? I really consider this not in each and every individual question, but when it comes to the relevant ones, I do so act like that. And it's always based on risk management. What's the maximum damage I can cause thereby? And am I really prepared to take this risk? That's the advantage of politicians. They may step down, they may be even um, sacked. That's one of the consequences. That makes me different from somebody else in my ministry who is a civil servant or an employee. Of course, they might be sacked normally, but I can be sacked overnight. That's also a personal risk which you take, like every delegate or MP who loses his mandate overnight. I'm aware of this. I can only say that I'm acting by best conscience, and I also follow advice. I'm serving to this government, and I understand myself like this. I'm not doing this because I haven't found another job. Let me just put it that way. I'm doing this because I'm convinced that that I feel it's important to have people who are willing to contribute, and that's also an ethical category. Maybe this is just mine, but it helps me also to serve as a risk compass. And of course, the other thing is that, of course, being prepared costs money, rightfully so. And we are discussing this as well. And thanks God, we also have the democratic majority on our side very often. I'm really deliberately saying this with regard to the CDU-CSU. In the budget committee, we are mostly in agreement in many cases. For instance, we now have launched some readiness agreements for pandemics very successfully. We also installed the Center of Vaccines at the Paul-Ehrlich Institute. We also started in Geneva to negotiate agreements with the WHO. We are now considering the National Reserve of Healthcare Protection to see what is a good way of keeping stocks in place. And we are now experiencing this in the debate about vaccines. Vaccines have a certain life cycle. And it's not only about vaccines, sometimes it's also just about bandages. How long can you store these materials? Now we needed this urgently for Ukraine and also for Israel, and it's being used, but we have to circulate it, we have to distribute it, and it all costs money. And of course, that's also a balancing of goods. Do I spend the money on that or not? And we really check this very much, and Mr. Gröhe will also agree with me from his time in office, whether we can use it differently, for instance, handing it over to the global south or to war areas. That's what we are doing regularly. And that is also something which should be communicated more frequently. It could be more. Simply the training of the safety trainings, etc., all that costs money. Maybe sometimes we have to report more frequently on that. And the question of the right measure, I'm also looking at our MPs saying, well, sometimes the executive is following the advice of parliament. No, that's a joke, of course. We always follow the advice of parliament. So what's the right measure is not a singular decision. It's always discussed also in parliament. That shall do on my side. So basically, we are already in the middle of the final discussion, and the best discussion is always the one you do not want to interrupt, and that goes very perfectly for this discussion too. But there is another highlight coming up tonight before we really go to the final awarding ceremony. So I'm asking you for a final word. You had a very nice quotation. I think there is another one which is attributed to Anglo-Saxon. There is one question to all. There is one answer to all questions, and it's always wrong. So that simplifies the question. But in our private life, like in politics, I may say that the setting of priorities for prevention is the most difficult conflict instead of just healing the damage. And that can be seen in our private budgets. Let me just come up with two examples. Firstly, I appreciate very highly, because I know that Karl Lauterbach, the German Minister of Health, is very much focusing on prevention, together we channeled the prevention law. But just in order not to praise you personally so too much, of course, prevention is first mainly a job of the insurance services, but they are spending 600 million on prevention, and on this day, 600 million for treatment. And when I tell you that contribution to the WHO are 30 millions, actually we spend more, but it gives you an idea of the question of international understanding. It's good that Germany has done more, but our obligatory contribution multiplied by 20 is the treatment cost on one day, including Christmas and other uh, party and other holidays. So it's a constant struggle, both privately and in the institution. So what you invest today, you may be using it someday, introducing damage, or it's also generating evidence for the correct prevention. And this is still a wide area, unknown. So that is why we are mostly the healers of crisis rather than those who avoid crisis. And that's also why we need pressure from the scientists so that we can break out of this circle, vicious circle. Thank you.
In the pandemic, one of the points that several scientists stressed is we could have done so much more for policymakers if our data had been made available and if they'd been linked. If the vaccination and the test data were linked to the registry data, for example, or if the COVID data were linked to registry data in the sense of being able to identify who hasn't been vaccinated or which groups really should be targeted. And for that reason, and now that we're in quiet times, I think we really have to work on making our data fair, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, and to make sure that the health data and the registry data and what other data, that they're linkable. And of course, this has to be done in a secure way, secure in the sense that it may not be hackable, and there are technical solutions to do that. And of course, it has to be done in a secure way in the sense of protecting people's privacy, anonymity. But that would be one point that I would like to finish with.
Thank you so much. Herr Schütte, Sie haben das letzte Wort.
Well, the bad thing is that the next crisis cannot be predicted. Even in the healthcare sector, when we are preparing vaccines, WHO every year is publishing a list of the 10 virus classes or stems which are having the potential of triggering epidemic or a pandemic. Number 10 is always virus X. That does not have anything to do with Twitter or X, namely, but that there is some unknown virus. That's the healthcare business. But the next crisis can also be produced by the fact that a nuclear power plant in the Czech Republic built by the Russians may explode, or that we have a power failure in our electrical system with all the consequences for communication, healthcare, etc. And it means we also need, and it gets even more complicated, that we have certain knowledge which will never be applied. When you just Google in the year 2013 or 14, there was a report to the German parliament by the disaster management office, which predicted two crisis scenarios. On the one hand, a worldwide pandemic due to viruses, and the second one was a flood in the German mountains. So there are even written scenarios which we still could not foresee exactly. So what is the pragmatic conclusion? I would like to start to distinguish between science and science advice. And I would like to say we need exactly these interfaces as an institutionalized form in order to handle such uncertainties after long considerations, and even after having been 10 years in the ministry. The Anglo-Saxon system of a science advisor and at the federal level, we should have one interface between science and the various departments of ministries to see where do we have to develop sensors in order to handle a certain crisis. This could be one way in order to get closer to such a dilemma. We will certainly, we may not be on the correct way, on the right track, but we have a much higher opportunity to be on the right track. And that is what we learned during the COVID crisis. Thank you. There could not be a better closing remark. So we also had a discussion on that before this meeting, and I would really like to agree with you. I think that was a marvelous panel. I thank all the participants from politics, from the foundations, from researchers, and for your participation as well. Thank you very much for coming and for joining us in our discussion.